it is claimed that we live in a free country. It is claimed that we live in a society where values such as free speech, the freedom of expression, the freedom of belief and faith are sacrosanct. Basically, they are guarded by the very foundations of society. Yet, clearly, that, I would suggest, is not the case when it comes to talking about Palestine, when it comes to criticizing Israel, and when it comes to talking about the rights of Palestinians specifically. Talking about Zionism as an ideology, as well as a political venture. It's extremely worrying that this, whilst, as I said, I mean, we claim to be democratic, we claim to be equal, we claim to hold high the value of free speech and free thinking, yet it is evident that once one touches the boundaries of Israel and Palestine and Zionism and the such, all those seem to disappear. I can actually cite, a very close media organization that have only recently been taken off Facebook because of some posts back in 2013, 2014, pertaining to Palestine, to a clash and attack on Gaza. So obviously, the question that I probably should start with is why? But I think I'm being a little bit disingenuous because I have a sense of why, I have a thinking of why. But from both your perspectives, I'd like to hear more about, your own observations about, why you think that we are here. Why is it that people are so afraid of expressing their views? You call for a demonstration and a march, and tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands turn up from all across society. But, you don't see the same figures when you're asking for people to actually voice their opinions openly and publicly and the such. They fear for their jobs, their careers. I recall a young man who once fronted a march for Palestine being called into the office the next day saying, listen, do you want a career or do you not? Why is that? Why is that?
I think it goes back many years. There's been a concerted effort since I would say 2005, when the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement was launched by the Palestinians. And Israel saw that as a threat. Israel, pro-Israeli organizations, Zionist organizations around the world, in their mind, having a BDS movement in the similar way as you had a boycott, divestment against South Africa is an existential threat. So I think they mobilized into action and gear from as far back as 2005, even before that. I think having realized that, I think 2009 as well, Operation Cast led a number of strategists and analysts from the Reuters Institute. They recognized that Israel's reputation in the world has taken a nosedive, and therefore they had to counter that. As a result of that, you will see a number of organizations, so-called grassroots organizations, developing in London, in the US, trying to counter what they call delegitimization of Israel. So various grassroots organizations. I should make a distinction between civil grassroots organizations, bottom-up grassroots organizations, and top-down grassroots organizations. So they developed these legal agencies, think tanks, and propagandists, I would say, to counter the anti-delegitimization of Israel. And part of that has led to where we are, where a definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates, criticism of Israel, is at the center of anti-Semitism, and it's being used for regulatory purposes. And universities and organizations around, capitals in Europe and in the West generally are being forced to adopt that. And the adoption of that has led to horrendous miscarriage of, I would say, justice. We have one guest here today, David Miller. People like David and so many others in the US, in Germany, in France, are being, are being terrorized, I would say, and afraid to speak out on Israel, fearing that any criticism of Israel could get them into trouble and get them to.
But it's quite a dangerous thing. I mean, this flaunting of anti-Semitism as the very first charge, and just brandishing it around so casually. Surely it threatens to make, to really devalue the whole thing about anti-Semitism, which in itself is quite an evil thing. To be racist in that way and to, discriminate against someone for being Jewish or the like is criminal, is nigh on criminal. In fact, it is criminal. But every single criticism that we have of what Israel is doing, how the Palestinians are being treated, to readily have anti-Semitism as the charge is surely damaging to the whole cause of non-discrimination.
I mean, I think it is. I think it does run the risk of encouraging, what should we say, Judeophobia or anti-Jewish feelings and thoughts in the society. But I don't really think that anti-Semitism is a major problem in Western societies. It hasn't been for some decades now. There are some pockets amongst the fascist movements where there's still anti-Semitism as a racial philosophy still exists. But there's no real sense of feelings about Jews in this country like that at all. In fact, the opposite's the case, that people have become more and more tolerant of ethnic diversity, and including black people as well as to some extent in relation to Muslims and Islam. But there's no real racism against Jewish people in the UK, for example, now, in the way that there is against black people, and certainly there is against Muslims, which I would call Islamophobia. So I think that we make a mistake if we think that we can just say, well, of course we're opposed to anti-Semitism and we're opposed to all forms of racism, and anti-Semitism is terrible, and it really exists in the country, because it doesn't really. I mean, the people who say it exists in the country are the Zionist groups, and these are groups which are all, not tightly, but all loosely coordinated from Israel. I mean, and the idea, you were talking about the IHRA and the definitions of anti-Semitism. The idea that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are the same thing is not something which is just by accident becomes something which has been imposed by some kind of mysterious process. It's something which, of course, was developed directly by the Zionist regime, along with a number of Zionist organizations from the UK and indeed from France and the US. And they've created this idea that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are the same thing. And since the year 2000, when they started the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism, which has had regular meetings in Tel Aviv.
So if anti-Semitism isn't the problem, what is?
Well, in terms of racism in the society, the main form of racism in the UK today is against Muslims. And let's look at the figures, the data collected, for example, by a very compromised body, but nevertheless, look at the data compiled by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and you see in that data that the most privileged ethnic group in the country are the Jews, by a long way, above the Hindus, who are the second most, above Christians and white people. And which group's at the bottom? Oh, big surprise, it's the Muslims. And they're the ones who bear the brunt of economic discrimination, of poverty, and indeed, of course, of the main driving force of racism in the country, racist policing and the counter-terrorism apparatus and the security state and all of those kinds of things. No Jew is picked up on the street by the police on a regular basis for looking Jewish. Muslims are. No Jew is stopped when he comes back into the country from a flight or on the Eurostar because they're Jewish. It simply doesn't happen. There's no racial profiling of Jews. There is racial profiling of Muslims and of people who adhere to Islam. So there is a real problem of racism in the society, which we should tackle. But there's no equivalence between the way in which Jews are treated in the society, either economically or in terms of racism from the state, the main driver of racism, and the treatment meted out to Muslims. So I think we should have a clear knowledge of that. Look at the data, and you can see from the data which groups are advantaged and which groups are disadvantaged. Is there a risk of racialization of Jews coming back with the kind of stuff you saw with the Nazis? Not really. If that started to happen, then of course we should fight that. But it's not really a risk of that happening in this country. There might be in other places. There are strong ways in which Nazi ideology is present in some countries. I would say, obviously, in Ukraine is one example. And probably we don't want to get onto that as a topic, but what we need to look at here, it seems to me, is the way in which the idea that the Jews as a group are unsafe in the country is promoted by Zionist organizations, and in particular, of course, those organizations which are set up to tackle anti-Semitism, which claim simply to be Jewish organizations, but which are, of course, in fact, lobbyists for the state of Israel.
I mean, you mentioned, Nasim, that you find the initiation of the BDS movement in 2005 and then Cast-led in 2009 as being drivers and triggers to this whole thing that we're talking about today. I remember a report issued, I think it was by Europol, I might be wrong, back in around 2007, 2008, where 20,000 European citizens across 8 countries were asked the question, who do you think is the greatest threat to world peace? And the answer came by far, Israel. And these were not Muslims, they were not Palestinians, they were ordinary European citizens from across the board, across many, many countries. And to me, I think that triggered something in the Zionist movement particularly, that if that is the feeling of people who are not really, ideologues, they're not being indoctrinated, they're not being, and that's what they think, then something needs to be done. And that, to an extent, explains why it is that the Israeli PR machine in Europe and America spends the most, whereby, despite the fact that countries there are its closest allies. Yeah. That in ordinary terms, it doesn't really need to spend too much in America, for instance, where Israel is seen as the 51st state, or in Europe, where basically there is no quarrel with Israel. So, but I think that is what triggered something in the mind of the Zionist machinery that something needed to be done.
Yeah, which is why they launched the project of Brand Israel. We have to defend the reputation of Israel. And what you're describing really is still an ongoing phenomenon where Israel is losing support amongst American Jews. Before, where Israel used to be a bipartisan issue, this year is the first time where Democrats overwhelmingly support Palestinians over Israel. So it's losing the bipartisan support and the support he enjoyed. I mean,
it's interesting you mentioned America. Apologies for interrupting, but you reminded me that when I first visited the US in 2000, and I tried to speak about Palestine, my Muslim hosts said, "Oh, please don't even go there. This is a this is a no-go area." Yeah. Yet now we see that it's discussed in Congress. I mean, that is a shift of...
Nakba last week was discussed in the Congress. There was an event held. The point I'm making, so generally grassroots population in the US, in the UK as well, I think they're generally turning against Israel. The reputation of Israel is very low. But the establishment figures, especially on the right, they still see Israel as an ally, which is why you see the backlash in the form of legislations to undermine pro-Palestinian activism and control spaces like in the university, social media, all kind of spaces. And part of that is to incorporate the IHRA as a way of regulating the discourse on Israel. And that, to me, that goes to the heart of the issue. If you're saying anti-Semitism is on the rise, by using a definition of anti-Semitism where 7 out of the 11 examples conflates hatred towards Jews with criticism of Israel, then of course you can find all kinds of examples where there is a rise in anti-Semitism. It'd be equivalent to a Muslim saying criticism of Saudi Arabia is Islamophobic, criticism of Iran is Islamophobic. Any Muslim majority country, if you criticize that country, you're Islamophobic. If you adopted that definition, then automatically, Islamophobia, the rate of Islamophobia would go up exponentially. So again, go to the bottom of what is the definition of anti-Semitism that you're using. And we see that there's a reluctance to engage in that discussion. When you say Labour's, steeped in anti-Semitism, okay, what are the examples? Give me, what is the example of anti-Semitism that you're using? What does that really mean? the media is reluctant to address and open this discussion. We saw the Labour files, Al Jazeera Labour files, which highlight and basically expose a lot of what I'm saying now. Yeah. But there was a complete media silence on the issue because they're just afraid to open up this issue. So I think,
Well, I mean, they're afraid, yes, but also, that there is, I mean, as with many other areas of British life, there is penetration by the Zionists. So there are key people, key Zionists in particular roles in journalism, just as there are in other areas of culture, just as there is in economics. And that means that it's difficult to raise, and you get pushback inside those organisations when you raise these kinds of questions. And so you have, I mean, look at even the example of The Guardian, the famed liberal organisation, which they used to take pieces from me. I mean,
lo and behold,
no longer.
And from me.
Yeah, and from John Pilger and many others. that can't happen anymore because there's a Zionist stranglehold essentially on what gets into the paper. So I mean that goes all across the society. And you said about the idea of them organising in the US and in the UK. Well, the Zionists, meaning both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also the Mossad, and then of course all their many minions and shlichim, as they call them, their emissaries, operate all around the world, and they do this in a deliberate sort of fashion, an organised fashion. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us that happens. But it's not that they are worried about the relationship with the state, although I think that is coming. It's that, as you say, they're worried about public opinion. And so they try and undermine the possibility of opposition, and they try and do that by colonising public space and by stopping governments from taking decisions which would interfere with their human rights abuses and the appalling activities of the Zionist state.
And the thing is that today, I mean, we're finding people suffer on every single level, not just being sacked from their jobs, but basically never ever being entertained ever again in public forums, in articles, people's careers have been derailed as a result of something that they tweeted or possibly even retweeted something like 10 years ago. And I use the example of, for instance, the heavily elected NUS president, Daymash Al-Lali, who suffered as soon as the results came out, who suffered immensely as a result of something that she had shared on Facebook, over 10 years ago, as someone who was 17 years old. It's
which wasn't in itself in any way problematic.
Absolutely. And this is where I find that we have gradually, and it might be because of this, but generally speaking, free spaces are being heavily regulated, heavily censored, and are being restricted. We talk sometimes about prevent, for instance, but they're sort of intertwined, because we have cases of 11-year-olds going and searching about Palestine and then being reported to prevent by their teachers or head teachers, because why is he or she, for instance, researching on Palestine?
Well, support for Palestine is seen as one of the markers of
radicalization.
Yes, that's right, but it's even worse than that, because many of these organisations which are funded by Prevent, or the Building a Safer Britain Together initiative, and all those kind of streams of funding from the Department for Levelling Up, as it's now called, and indeed from the Home Office. I mean, many of the organisations that are funded directly by the British state as part of its counter-terrorism and counter-extremism work are actually Zionist organisations. Or they're organisations which claim to be interfaith organisations, to work together between Muslims and Jews, or Muslims and Jews and Christians. But actually these are organisations set up directly by Zionists in order to make it impossible for Muslims in public life to say anything about the Palestinians. I mean, there are tons of these organisations. We've been exposing them in our show, Palestine Declassified. One of them, for example, is Nasim Ahmed, an organisation set up by the Board of Deputies, which, when we confronted them with this, they said, oh, no, we weren't set up by the Board of Deputies, but it's on the BOD's own website that they incubated them. So these are organisations which are Zionist infiltration operations, but which are directly funded by the British state. And that's an indication, really, I think, of the colonization by the Zionists of friendly governments. I mean, the government of Britain and of the US are the strongest supporters of the Zionist regime, but nevertheless, the Zionists insist on trying to penetrate these states. Let me give you one example, and I'll give way to, but back in the 1950s, MI5 discovered an Israeli spy inside the Joint Intelligence Committee, right? And they got rid of the guy, right? But the internal documents, which are now declassified, say, oh, now this is 1952. Now we realize that Israel is a hostile foreign state. And they just put it just like that. So there was a current of opinion inside MI5 at the time, which understood how Mossad operates. And that current will still be there to some extent, but it's been overwhelmed by pro-Israel forces within the intelligence services and the security services and the security state. And that's a real problem in the sense that they've effectively colonized key parts of the security state, which cannot recognize that there is a genuine national security threat from the state of Israel.
And I think what David's describing is a common playbook of authoritarians around the world at the moment. Not Israel, of course, probably does it more than anyone else. We saw last week example of how India's Narendra Modi has tried to stoke anti-Muslim fervor in Leicester last year. And details came out last week from UK intelligence showing that there was a connection between Modi's Hindutva anti-Muslim government with activists on the ground in Leicester stoking anti-Muslim hostility. Yeah. So that's just an example of how one authoritarian works, but that kind of is a good example of how Israel also has penetrated into various parts of society, in universities, in campuses and elsewhere, to try and stoke, first of all, hatred towards any critics of Israel, and I would say stoke Islamophobia in some instances. So that's a tried and tested method, which I think Israel has used to...
But in reality, and I think that we've all observed this, that this pushback on behalf of the state of Israel and the Zionist movement has resulted in an ever-increasing wave of young as well as old people who are seeing this as deeply troubling. And I have many of my friends, some even neighbors actually, a couple of neighbors whom we have frequent discussions, who tell me that they know nothing about Israel and Palestine, but they are deeply troubled by the fact that it's so scary to talk about Israel, to discuss anything pertaining to Israel. And that in itself is bringing people to read more, to understand more, to seek the other perspective, and to basically join forces. That's why the marches for Palestine, the marches against the siege on Gaza, are getting ever and ever bigger.
Well, what you're saying is there's a really powerful example in the US where one of the owner of a business, he was asked to sign a document saying he will not boycott Israel. So this is in Texas somewhere. It's in a documentary called The Boycott. Yeah. So in his mind, I've got nothing to do with Israel-Palestine. Yeah. Why am I, an American citizen, being told to sign a document saying I will not boycott Israel? Yeah. And he felt his rights, his First Amendment was being undermined. Well, why should I be signing this document? So in the US, I think it's something like 25, 30 states have adopted policies demanding that if you're going to have any kind of business transaction with the state, you sign a document basically pledging not to boycott Israel. Why should America do that? Yeah. So Americans, out of their own sense of patriotism, are pushing back against that. They're realizing it's penetrated, this pro-Israel stance is penetrated so deep in society that it's undermining their freedoms, it's undermining democracy and their rights. And he's an example of one person pushing back, and there are many more like him.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's also a danger that they face. I mean, they face danger from world public opinion and from most of the world's governments. But there's a danger they face also in the shift to the right in the Israeli government. So that the disputes that there currently are inside occupied Palestine with Zionists protesting against the government is a real threat for them, because what you see then is that even a country like the US becomes skeptical about whether its interests are best served by supporting the Zionist entity. Now, in the recent demonstrations, for example, there's an organisation which is encouraging these demonstrations, which is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is known as the CIA's sidekick. So effectively, the CIA is funding demonstrations against its own ally, the State of Israel. Now, what's going on there, of course, is that there's a split within the Israeli state. Mossad are allowing their staff to engage in demonstrations against the government. And it's said from those recent Pentagon leaked documents that this is going on. It's been revealed in any case in the press that both the Shin Bet, which is the Internal Security Service, and the Mossad, and indeed the IDF have said that elite forces and intelligence officers can demonstrate against the government. Now, that's partly because the settler movement, the sort of fascist element of the settler movement, it is itself wanting to move towards an openly imperialist policy, so that it contests US imperialism, essentially. It's no longer, as people used to say, the attack dog, but it's moving towards being its own, in itself, an imperialist power. And that's a red line which the US won't allow it to cross. So we see, difficulties for them in that sense, in their major supporter, and difficulties for them with the united resistance in Palestine, and indeed the support that the resistance has around about Palestine in Iran, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and other places. And these are really difficult problems for the Zionists to deal with. And they one of their responses is, as we've been saying, is invest in propaganda and try and stop the possibility of people taking action against them.
What's happened in your case, David?
Well, in my case, I mean, I arrived at the University of Bristol in 2018, and a couple of months later I gave a lecture on Islamophobia, where I mentioned that one of what I've called the 5 pillars of Islamophobia is parts of the Zionist movement, that Zionists funders fund openly Islamophobic groups, Islamophobic think tanks and the like. These are matters which are both factual and based on my own research. And a couple of students didn't like that. They complained to an Israel lobby group who made a complaint. That was rejected. Then the University of Jewish Students in London and the Bristol Jewish Society, which is a member of the Union of Jewish Students, made a formal complaint, which was investigated over 2.5 years and was rejected on every single ground. And 6 weeks later, after I'd been cleared of everything, I went in a public meeting and said that I'd been attacked and complained about, simply factual matters. And that, of course, all hell was let loose as a result of that. I couldn't possibly refer to the fact that I'd been attacked and complained about with a completely ridiculous complaint, as was found by the QC who investigated the complaint. And as a result, then a huge campaign was got up, including over 100 MPs and many others, to get me sacked. And they eventually sacked me after another investigation, which again found me not guilty of any anti-Semitism. They decided to in any case, sack me not because of the words I'd said, but because of the way you said this. The words. No, I had no idea then, and I still don't know what that means. I went through an appeal. It was rejected. We now have the last stage, which is an industrial tribunal, coming up in October this year, 2 weeks of court time, where I seek to establish that I've been wrongly dismissed.
I mean, this is troubling. This is troubling because, you're a professor of sociology. Research and academia, surely, they are areas whereby you go beyond. If someone down the cafe was looking up, something on, I don't know, Nazism, for instance, you'd be concerned. But someone who's doing research in academia, you'd allow, because that's part of human knowledge. You need to understand these things, just like a friend of ours who many years ago, who went because he was doing his master's degree on Al-Qaeda narratives and went and downloaded some of their research, and his life was turned over. And he ended up, being deported back to his country, and he didn't finish his degree. Surely there is a problem. And we're talking here about being in the United Kingdom. We're talking about a place where academic freedoms are seen as sacred and guarded. What is happening here? And what is the trajectory? Where are we getting to? As activists, we're being closed down. As media speakers and writers, we're being closed down. But now we have the case where academics and researchers are also being closed down.
Yeah, I mean, we of course we cover Israel Palestine. I don't think there's every month there's an example of a story we will cover where one academic or another has come under threat of being expelled for speaking about Israel Palestine. Last few weeks ago it was Lara Shehi from the US, and before it was someone else. There's so many academics. I mean, when I look at this sometimes, I think the pro-Israeli lobby have tapped into a modern zeitgeist in the sense that what I feel is more important than any factual truth or any principle out there. My feeling is my reality. Feelings have been given more prominence over any kind of objective research, objective principles that we hold. And I think they whereas the left and the modern, what some people negatively call the woke, but people who are understand the structures of racism, they use that to basically dismantle, understand racism in a proper, honest way. The Zionists, what they seem to have latched onto is saying that my feeling of being attacked or Israel being attacked is an attack on my identity. So they're using this identity discourse not to protect themselves from racism, but to protect Israel. And I think they've tapped into something which is very, very powerful. They've discovered that a while back, I think, and they're using that. And where to use that better than universities, where students can, where there is a culture war happening. This is the front line of culture war, universities, campuses. And students are being recruited and I would say indoctrinated to peddle this line that attack on Israel is an attack on my identity. And my self-expression has as much value as a black person who's basically facing racism from the police every single day. So when you have a reality where self-expression and individual experience is given prominence and value more than objective reality, objective principles and research, which David's work is based on, that's what you end up with.
I recall days when I was frequently asked to speak to public meetings in university campuses and to speak to students and to agree, disagree, to have a ding-dong, with everyone regarding what I said, what I think, or the such. And that was a time when, on average, I would get an invitation, probably 2 invitations a week. For the past 10 years, I would say that has dwindled down to, if lucky, once a year. And always surrounded by, preceded by, and then succeeded by a huge wave of letters, of complaints, of emails, and the such. And it's deeply disconcerting. My political activism began in the mid to late 80s with the South African anti-apartheid protests. And that was when my political awareness sort of begun. And it just troubles me so much that students today aren't allowed to engage in a discussion. Have them air their views and then have a quarrel. Have an argument, just speak against
disagreement is racism. Disagreement is anti-Semitism.
It's
just disagreement.
It's deeply problematic, and it tells me, and I fear, of generations of students who will emerge not having debated freely, not having discussed freely, having told that their inner thoughts must be curtailed and must be oppressed and suppressed so that basically they don't threaten their careers, or they don't risk never finding a job.
They're sort of being told that it's not just their words which is problematic, but their thoughts.
Their thoughts.
It's the thoughts behind, or the assumed intentions behind what they've said, which are problematic. And it's crazy, but that's where we are in society now, and part of that's been developed by the Zionist movement, but part of it's also been developed by the kind of decay of the West. I mean, really, we are in a situation where the triumph of liberal democracy, of capitalist values, is coming to an end, and it's collapsing, into a kind of crazy identity politics morass. and so it's no wonder that people around the world look at what's happening in France, Germany, the US, the UK, and they say, these people are mad. These people are absolutely mad. And as a result, you don't have much in the way of support for the West or for liberal, for what would have been called Enlightenment projects anymore. It's a kind of collapse of, I suppose you used to call it consumer society, but a kind of collapse of Western civilization, I think. I mean, that's pretty in grand terms, but I think that's what we're seeing. This society is collapsing. And it's going to be replaced. And just at the same time as we are in a situation where geopolitically, both in terms of economics and in terms of global realignments, the West is on the way out. Everyone sees that with the launch of the proxy war against the Russians. The power of US imperialism is waning. The increasing trend towards de-dollarization, the Chinese brokered relationship between the Saudis and the Iranians, all of these are signs that US power has peaked and is on its way down. And I think that this is the cultural counterpart of that process. And maybe we won't see the full flourishing of that for some years to come, but I think it expresses something about a kind of sickness in Western society, that Western societies are not able to fulfill the ambition of liberal ideas of justice, equality, and those kinds of things. It doesn't work. Everybody sees that now, I think, in a way that they didn't 20 years ago, they didn't 30 years ago. So I think we're moving into a new historical period where the previous certainties are starting to melt.
Yeah, on a more granular level, I mean, just the discourse and the language, we can't even agree on terms anymore when we talk about social justice, and everyone brings their own truth to the table. And you think, okay, how do I dispute that? Whereas if you start with principles, we know from a principle point of view, there was an Akbar. Under international law, occupation is illegal. If it's permanent, becomes permanent. Yeah. We know settlement is illegal. We know, for example, colonizing people is illegal. We have consensus amongst human rights groups. There is apartheid. We know what apartheid is. Yeah. So we know all these things from a factual point of view based on principles. But now you come bring your truth. No, that's anti-Semitic. Calling Israel apartheid is anti-Semitic. Why? That's my reality. That's what I feel. How do you contest that? You bring evidence, you bring principles, you bring, a whole load of reports, and someone says, no, I don't believe that because it attacks my identity. I feel Israel is being attacked, and you're attacking me. Therefore, so how do you contest that?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, this is based on a kind of the postmodern movement in philosophy, and postmodernism, where there are no truths. But let's not onto that question. But on the other hand, there is also the use by the Zionists of a whole series of left-wing ideas, identity politics being one of them, or seemingly left-wing ideas. And the idea that I see some of the people on social media now, Jewish people living in occupied Palestine, referring to themselves as being indigenous Judeans. Right? And you're like, no, that's factually not right. That's not correct. Most of the people who've occupied Palestine come from either from North Africa or from Europe.
I mean, there were indigenous Jews, a very small minority, yes, but the overwhelming majority are not indigenous. That's right. That discussions.
Well, they were Arabs, right?
That's right.
They were Arabs who had various
Arab
religions.
Jews.
That's right. But they're now called something else because the Zionists want to make them separate. That's right. And it's the construction of this Zionist narrative, which they spent a huge amount of effort on. But they're trying to colonize the idea of decolonization. Which is kind of an important set of arguments in academia. They're trying to suggest that they're an indigenous people set, and they've been colonized by the Arabs. I mean, it's incredible, but that's the part of the strategy.
It's on the flip side. There's a growing pro-Palestinian movement. There's a growing pro-Palestinian awareness. There's a growing awareness of the Palestinian narrative, which was for decades, which was totally neglected. It was hidden even. It was totally downtrodden. Now there's a re-emergence of that. And many of the members of those campaigns are themselves Jews who, see the fallacies in the Zionist narrative. And therefore you find now that, like I mentioned, I mean, marches that happen up and down the country, across Europe, even in the United States now, that raise the Palestinian flag, that talk about what's happening in Gaza. By the way, I mean, just talking about Gaza, the fact that now, what is it? We're talking about 17 years under siege, 2 million people closed off. I mean, let's be honest here.
19 years and 17 bombardments in Gaza in the 19 years.
It's just obscene, the fact that we're not allowed to speak of what's happening to, I mean, we talk about children's rights, we talk about women's rights, but yet no one can talk of Gazan children, Gazan women and the such, and what they've been suffering, Gazan families. The siege alone, and then the bombardment over that, and no one can talk about that. But we're seeing an emergence of this new sort of protest against this authoritarian, almost fascist approach to safeguarding, Israel from anyone's attacks. As a writer, as someone who works with a research center that talks about Palestine, that promotes Palestinian writers, novels, narratives, and the such, I'm sure that you come across many examples of young men and women emerging who want to be engaged with that.
Of course, yeah. I mean, what you mentioned, there is a lot of positives out there, despite swimming against the current. The pro-Palestinian activism around the world is growing, which is why you see the backlash. The backlash is the way it is because pro-Palestinian activism is so strong and powerful around the world. BDS, despite what Israel says, BDS is a growing phenomenon. So I take a lot of pleasure in that, in the fact that despite states, Western governments, galvanizing, criminalizing pro-Palestinian activism, there's still so much support for Palestine. And not only that, mainstream support for Palestine. And one of the biggest indicators, which I mentioned earlier, was the fact that the Democratic Party overwhelmingly now supports Palestine over Israel, which for me is quite a milestone.
Absolutely.
For many years, Israel was a bipartisan issue. It no longer is a bipartisan issue. And that's sending, shockwaves in Tel Aviv. What do we do now? Even Zionist organizations like the Board of Deputies here in the UK, their previous leaders, he remarked following the 2001 uprising, following attack on Sheikh Jarrah, he said basically, we fear that Israel is going to be soon aligned to just right-wing extremist, far-right organizations. There is not going to be a single progressive, middle-of-the-road, centrist, liberal organization that will be willing to support Israel. Because as we know, there's a consensus Israel has become an apartheid state. But the way I look at it is that they don't care at the moment. A lot of these Western governments, they don't care. So what if Israel is an apartheid state? The existence of Israel in its current form, the status quo, is way more important than any value we may hold to be dear, whether it be democracy, whether it be freedom of speech. None of this matters to us as long as Israel survives in its current state. But that cannot hold. So that's showing, of course, the hypocrisy of the West, but that hypocrisy cannot sustain itself in perpetuity. So
I mean, young Jews that see the nature of their current government in Israel, surely must be absolutely horrified. And at the same time, I don't know, is it just me? But over years now, I don't know, since I remember 2000, 2002, every single time we used to have a march or a protest or a vigil by the far right. At the time, it was Nick Griffin and his bunch. And then it's evolved into something called Britain First and then Tommy Robinson. Every single one of those marches has an Israeli flag.
Yeah.
Is that right? So the fears that you mention are there. I always used to be baffled by the fact, why is no one coming out from the Israeli embassy, let's just say, saying, listen, by the way, we don't want our flag, our national flag, being tarnished in this way, being associated with these thugs or fascists or neo-Nazis. This is where it really, descends into absolute absurdity.
So that's a simple answer for me, is there's an effort to remake the West by the far right as we know it, and remake the West in the way Israel has been remade. Ethno-nationalist, racist state, racial purity, racial exclusivity. That's the model they want. And this is the model which the far right wants to impose on the West, which is why they hate Muslims, they hate refugees, they hate anyone who's not white, and they want to remake this state model in its existent current form to something which is closer to Israel, ethno-nationalist state. And that's the reason for the affinity with Israel. They see Israel as something to aspire to recreate in their own country, and hence the affinity.
What would you say, David, to the students, the activists who want to have, who want to afford platforms on Palestine, but fear that there will be repercussions that will impact on their lives and future careers? Well, I mean, from your own experience, what would you say to them? What would you tell them?
Well, I think there's too much fear. I think people are too scared of taking action. But also, I think that many of the organisations on our side are themselves too timid and are compromised by their involvement with liberal Zionist organisations. I mean, I've just come from shooting an episode of Palestine Declassified today, where we've dealt with an organisation called Yachad, which is styles itself an anti-occupation Jewish organisation, and which is putting pressure on more radical parts of the Palestine Solidarity movement not to platform people who are supportive of Palestinian liberation. And that cannot be allowed to continue. And of course, the counter-argument is, well, we have to have these people because it broadens our appeal. Well, no, it doesn't. It stops you from having a proper cutting edge to your movement. And of course, this is a part of a backlash against the more radical mood in the Palestinian liberation movement in Palestine and indeed in this country, where, for example, expressed by Palestine Action with their occupations of Elbit factories and the current ongoing siege in Leicester, and just the other day, the attack on the Newcastle factory of Raphael, another Israeli arms firm. Now, there's an attempt within the Palestine Solidarity movement to undermine that more radical spirit. And so I would say to people who are supportive of this more radical spirit, which seems to me to be eminently sensible, to simply tell their organisations no and to go ahead and organise things, to organise meetings, and not be put off by official diktats that they can't organise them. Have them elsewhere. Have them on the street. I mean, I was in Scotland a few months ago, and I was to do a meeting in Edinburgh and a meeting in Glasgow, both of which were banned at the last minute. One by the police, because they were phoned up by Zionists and pressured, and one by the Quakers in London. They pressured the Edinburgh office of the Quakers, who were standing firm, and made them turf us out. We had much bigger meetings outside and round the corner than would otherwise have been the case. So you can fight back against these things, and it can work. And so I would urge people to have confidence, to be brave, and to take the steps and to support the Palestinians, because that's what the moral thing for us to do.
It's surely good when courts turn down the proposal of governments to ban or to prohibit BDS.
Sure. I mean, it's an ongoing process, isn't it? I mean, you talked about the experience in the US and that documentary you mentioned called Boycott, fantastic documentary. But yeah, I mean, the pressure is mounting and mounting. They sack people, they close people down, they get them deselected as candidates, they get them removed from their jobs, they have their professional associations condemn them. All of that has a really significant effect on us in terms of the people who it affects, and also the wave of fear that it creates. But on the other hand, the support for Palestine has never been stronger, and people understand increasingly the need for Palestinian liberation, not just the end to the occupation of the West Bank, but the need for Palestinian liberation. And so we need to be confident and be strong, and not to take the views of those parts of the movement who are effectively soft on Zionism, and effectively, if I can put it this way, they're an infiltration of Zionists into the Palestinian liberation movement. We need to make sure that cannot be allowed to happen. We can't be allowing Zionists to pressure us to deplatform some of the best people in our movement.
The presence of pro-Palestinian voices within Parliament, I mean, that used to be something that was there. There used to be the Labour Friends of Palestine. There used to be, the Liberal Democrat Friends of Palestine. They both changed their names in order to engulf the Middle East and Israel and the such. But there seems to be a depth of voices that are willing to come out and to speak publicly about Palestinian rights, not even in the terms that we're talking about now, but even, about 67, for instance, the borders of the West Bank and Gaza and the like. Very, very few. Surely that's an area of concern, don't you think?
Yeah, huge concern. I remember a decade ago, if you wanted to hold an event in Parliament,
number
of MPs would agree to, host an event on our behalf. But now it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, what it reminds me of is exactly what the drafter of this controversial IHRA definition of anti-Semitism himself said, that this will have a chilling effect on free speech. And I think nowhere is this felt more than in parliaments, where MPs feel, what am I going to say about Israel if all what that I can say can be somehow misconstrued as anti-Semitic?
Yeah.
For academics, for activists, it's not much of it is a problem, but not as much as it is for an MP, who would be much more careful about what they say. And if you have a definition which Labour has adopted, Conservatives have adopted, and many other institutions have adopted, which basically says that, questioning key aspects of the reality of the occupation, reality of Israel's existence, is anti-Semitic. What do you say?
Yeah.
So it's best just avoid it. Best just to stay clear.
Yeah.
And this is the chilling effect which Kenneth Stern, the author of the IHRA definition himself, warned about. Of course, the Zionist lawyer would say, no, this is not going to have a chilling effect. We just want to make sure, we stop anti-Semitism. But you've defined anti-Semitism in such a way where it conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Jewish racism.
Yeah.
What space has been left for free inquiry, free discussion?
I recall many years ago when Jenny Tung, who was a front bencher with the Liberal Democrats, when she went and visited Israel and then went into into Palestine, to the so-called occupied territories, and so-called because they're far more expansive than they are led to state, and at a checkpoint. And describing her experience at the checkpoint, she said, well, I'm just thinking of what Palestinians go through every single day. Mothers who go into labor, people who are trying to get to school, children trying to get to school, people trying to get to their jobs so that they're not sacked. And she said, if I was going through that day in, day out, I might have acted in the same way as Palestinians are acting out sometimes. And that absolutely ruined her political career.
Yeah.
So, again, if politicians and front benchers can't express those kinds of views. I mean, she said nothing. She said nothing apart from what she had seen.
Sure.
And how that had impacted her and what that led her to think or believe. And her career was absolutely... After that, she was toxic. I mean, every single meeting that she was invited to, no one else would come to.
Yeah, well, I find the same thing. People won't come to meetings if I'm on the platform. It's a witch hunt to try and exclude particular voices which are critical of Zionism. I mean, in a way, they sort of say to you, you're allowed to be critical of Israel, but only within certain confines, only ways which we say are appropriate. You have to be critical of Israel in the same way as you would about any other democracy, but Israel's not like any other democracy. And nobody says that you can't be critical of Britain in a way which is different to being critical of America. Of course you can be critical of Britain. I mean, it's completely crazy. The idea that there is a state of Israel has some kind of inalienable right to exist. No state has the inalienable right to exist. Not least of which, of course, is what is it we call this country? The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I mean, what kind of a nation is that? I mean, as you can tell, I'm from Scotland, and I personally believe in the breakup of this country. I think that this state should cease to exist forthwith. Does that make me a racist? Of course not. It's completely absurd. But nevertheless, they've constructed this idea that if you question the right of the state of Israel to exist, you are somehow anti-Jewish. On the contrary, it's a question of solving the problem of settler colonialism. And the only way to solve the problem of settler colonialism is to abolish the settler colony. Right? Does that mean that you have to kill all the Jews? Of course not. It means you abolish the colonial relations which underpin the occupation, just as it was the case in
Nelson Mandela dismantled apartheid, but South Africa did not cease to exist. South Africa exists.
Indeed. And just as in the case in Ireland, where the settler colony in the north of Ireland continues to exist, we've got a stasis there, a problem which is not finally gone away because they haven't dismantled the settler colony, which gives advantages to Protestants. These are the same relations which underpinned all settler colonies. It's not a question of the unique badness of the Jews. It's to do with settler colonialism. It sets up this kind of inexorable program, and the only way to solve the problem from their point of view is the time-honored way of solving settler colonial problems. That is, you eliminate the natives, like in America, like in Canada.
Yeah.
But the alternative to that, of course, is you dismantle the settler colony. Now, of course, that's that needs to be done. You can't do that by just allowing there to be some kind of settler colonial situation where there's some kind of Palestinian Bantustans around the outside of it. That's not going to solve it.
Thank you very much, chaps. That's 55 minutes on the dot. That was a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.